Shalom and welcome to this home edition of the Middle East Report. And in this program today, we are going to be discussing the importance of the spiritual and political ideology that is Zionism. Warm welcome to the program, and today's special guest is all the way in Sydney on Australia. His name's Alex Ryvchin, and he is a leader in the Jewish community in Australia. Alex, absolute pleasure to have you on this home edition of the Middle East Report. And I've got to say that you are one of my early guests when this program was pioneering 10 years ago. And I'm so pleased that we're still in contact 10 years later. And you've grown on to have huge influence in your native country, Australia. So I'm so pleased that you're having an influence, particularly with this new book that you've written called Zionism, The Concise History.
Thank you so much. It's a great pleasure to be with you, Simon. And we were reflecting before we went on air about my interview with you 10 years ago, just after you started. And you were polished and astute and rigorous as a journalist then, and you are to this day. And everything that you've done in terms of bringing Jews and Christians together in support of Israel and shining a light on the region has been momentous, truly. And may you go from strength to strength in your important work, Simon.
Amen. I appreciate that. The same with you, Alex. Alex, you've got an extraordinary story, haven't you? The fact that you were born in Kiev in the Ukraine, your family were refuseniks who wanted to leave the Soviet Union. Tell us about your family background, what it was like growing up in the Soviet Union, and why in particular that your parents wanted to leave, and how you ended up in Australia.
So look, my story is not that dissimilar to many Jews, throughout history and modern times as well. And it's a story of trauma and movement and dislocation and new dawns and false hopes and so forth, and finally finding a place and a home and making the most out of life. As you said, my roots are in the Soviet Union. My family was from Kiev, and I was born there as well. And I learned a few years ago that our family home was a block away from a place called Baba Yar, which is a notorious ravine on the outskirts of the city, where in 1941, over 2 days in September, the Nazis and their Ukrainian collaborators machine gunned 33,771 Jews to death during the Holocaust. And the trauma of that, my family were fortunate enough to be evacuated a few weeks before the Nazis entered the city. They were spared, and as a result, I was born. But having that connection to that place, that physical proximity, the understanding of the grim history of it, and also inheriting the stories from my parents and grandparents of the daily abuse and ridicule and discrimination they faced as Jews in the Soviet Union. Abuse on the bus each day, in the shop queue, exclusion from university on the basis of their Jewish faith. This was an ordinary part of living in the Soviet Union as a Jew. And one of the things that changed the course of Jewish history and my life personally was the launch of an international campaign under the banner, Let My People Go, which is very fitting because we're now in the festival of Passover, where we commemorate the letting of the Jewish people go from Egypt, from bondage, through the hand of God. But the Jews in my time faced a different kind of tyranny, being communism. And fortunately, we were allowed to leave as a result of the success of that campaign and the opening up of the Soviet Union, the permission for Jews, for families like mine, who'd previously been refused exit, to be able to go and build new lives in the West. And it was our great blessing that we were taken in by Australia as refugees, and we established a life for ourselves there. And it was painfully difficult at the beginning, being totally alone, having no family and friends. The qualifications that my family had in the Soviet Union counted for nothing in Australia. They didn't know the language. But it's the classic migrant story. They made it work through sheer grit and determination and faith and belief. And it's allowed me to pursue my dreams of advocating for the Jewish people and fighting for the state of Israel.
Excellent. And Alex, what are the challenges facing the Jewish community in Australia? Because you are in Australia so far from Europe, you're so far from Israel and the United States. So what are the challenges facing the Jewish community in Australia?
Well, look, on the face of it, we share many challenges with Europe and with the United States. And when we look at, for example, trends in the US, whether it be the rise of far-right extremism, neo-Nazism, we have kind of embers of that here in Australia, not nearly to the same extent, but we have some of the same movements in their infantile form. We have sympathizers, and there's always the fear that one of them will act violently and carry out a crime against the Jewish community. When we look at the political challenges, we look at, for example, what happened in the UK under Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party, and how rapidly a once esteemed, prestigious, noble institution like UK Labour could be taken over in such a way and used to really confront and attack and assault the rights of the Jewish community and the rights of the Jewish people. So we're wary of these things, and we're concerned that these same trends might be visited upon us in Australia. But really, we are far away still, from a lot of these trends. And being a Jew in Australia is a great blessing. We feel incredibly safe in this country. We feel like a part of the fabric of this country. We can contribute to every aspect of its wealth and prestige and success. So I think one of the great risks, one of the great challenges that we face is actually apathy. When you have a situation where the Jews for thousands of years have been used to living with extreme levels of anti-Semitism, which for all its ills and problems unites our community, forces us to work together, to strive together, to maintain our Jewishness. And when you take off that pressure, that impetus that anti-Semitism creates, there's a risk that people will kind of drift, that you'll have the collective shrug of the shoulders, you'll have greater assimilation, and a loss of identity and faith and so forth. So one of the things that I'm motivated about is ensuring that our young people in the community understand that the blissful conditions under which we live today as Australian Jews are not the norm in Jewish history, they are the exception. This is a golden age for us, but these golden ages never last. So we need to put in place right now the measures to preserve and protect the community for generations to come, and never be complacent, never allow that to creep in.
And Alex, just looking at your biography here, you work for one of the largest law firms in the world when you were in London. That's when I met you. And also you awarded with the Israel Research Fellowship in 2012. And in February, you were promoted, this is February 2018, you were promoted to the co-chief executive office of the Australian Jewish community, really accelerated to the leadership of the entire Jewish community in Australia, which is an incredible achievement. Can you share with us your role and your responsibility really in that position of helping to lead Australia's Jewish community at this time?
So my organisation, the Executive Council of Australian Jewry, its counterpart body in the UK is the Board of Deputies of British Jews. So structurally, it's similar. We have great relations with your board. We consider them counterparts. We come together at the World Jewish Congress. And basically our function is very similar. We are the official elected representative body of the Australian Jewish community. We represent the community's interests to government, to the press, to the diplomatic corps, to civil society, and to the broader public. And our role is to advocate and speak for the community on the things that are critical to our way of life as Jews in Australia. So protecting our rights to religious freedom, to ensure that the right to live freely as a Jew in this country, to practice kashrut and Brit Milah, to have a Jewish education, that these things are never attacked, that our rights are never withdrawn in this way. Ensuring that society and opinion leaders understand anti-Semitism in all its forms, not merely, as Nazism, which is the most extreme form, the most violent form in history, and it's readily understood, but more kind of insidious, subtle forms of anti-Semitism, particularly those of the far left or Islamist anti-Semitism, are often misunderstood or neglected. So it's our role to ensure that the public and opinion leaders have a comprehensive understanding of what anti-Semitism is and the threat that it poses not only to our community, but to broader society. So we advocate on all things that are central to our way of life and to preserve that way of life in this country.
Excellent. And you've written this incredible book called Zionism, The Concise History. You sent me an electronic version, so I'm looking forward to seeing the hard version. But it's such an easy book to read, where you really do show the history of the Jewish people, and certainly the momentous return of the Jewish people to the land of Israel, with the first Jewish Aliyah in 1882, even though there was a small presence of a Jewish remnant in Jerusalem that had been there for thousands of years. And it's Zionism, which is the political, but also the spiritual ideology of the modern state of Israel. Can you give us a good definition of Zionism, and also why you felt compelled to write this book?
Sure. Well, Zionism, if we define it in its simplest, truest, most accurate form, it's the belief in or support of the right of the Jewish people to exercise national self-determination in some part of what was their ancestral homeland. And the Zionist movement, as we understand it today, emerges in the late 19th century in Europe with the aim of gathering in the Jews who were scattered to all corners of the earth, and creating a single coherent national emancipation movement, a liberation movement that would restore the Jews to their ancient lands. So that's basically Zionism. But to truly understand what Zionism is, we have to understand the concepts that are at its core. And these are often neglected or omitted. And the first such concept is the idea of Jewish peoplehood, that the Jews, aside from being a religious group bound by a monotheistic faith and the texts and traditions that come from it, are also a people. And we became a people in our land by virtue of originating in a single place, a place where we developed our traditions, where we developed the Jewish faith, where we developed our customs that hold to this day. So it's those two dual concepts of Jewish peoplehood and Jewish connection to land that are really the central tenets to Zionism. And it's from a desire to reunite the Jewish people as a people and restore us to our ancestral lands, that's where modern Zionism comes from. And to your second question,
sorry.
I was going to say, to answer the second part about what compelled me to write this, look, I think part of it was, seeing, as you are aware, Simon, and many of the viewers will be aware, that Zionism has become a degraded, maligned term, deliberately so. And that offends me as a Jew, and it offends me as someone who seeks to defend the truth as well. But it became apparent to me that if Zionism is allowed to be mischaracterized as racism, as Nazism, as colonialism, white supremacism, every other popular conception of evil known today, that this will be a battle. The battle against Zionism will ensnare Jews of the left and of the right, religious and secular, in Israel and the diaspora, without distinction. So I felt that I needed to reclaim Zionism, demystify it, explain it to the public, in order to protect the Jewish people, hopefully for a long time to come. And it had also become apparent to me that the people who we count on to be the next spokespeople, the advocates for Zionism, to simply explain what it is and why it's just and why it's equitable and noble and consistent with law and human rights, the Jewish youth, are often very ignorant of what Zionism is, even those who have come through the Jewish day school system. And so I wanted to create a resource for the curious reader who maybe doesn't have a set opinion on the issue, and also for the committed activist and the student to be able to pick up this book and read in perhaps one sitting or a couple of sittings over the course of a few days or a week, and have some grasp of what Zionism is, what it isn't, why it's so fundamental to Jewish identity and so inextricably linked to the very essence of what it means to be a Jew. And I hope that I've achieved that with this book.
A bit of a theological question for you, which you do mention in your introduction of your book, Zionism, the Concise History, is, does it start with the patriarchs of the Jewish faith and the patriarchs of the state of Israel, the likes of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, mentioned in the book of Genesis in the Bible? Or does it start with King David, with his conquest of Jerusalem and then establishing Jerusalem as the eternal capital of the state of Israel and the Jewish people?
Well, look, if you talk about the start, then it has to be with Abraham. It has to be with Abraham being shown the way by the Lord and by being told to go there and establish a nation in that land. That has to be the earliest foundation of Zionism. What King David, of course, did was to then unify the tribes, the kingdoms into a single coherent commonwealth with Jerusalem as a capital 3,000 years ago. And so both of these events are enormous landmarks in the history of Zionism. And again, because Zionism is understood as a modern movement, which is only about 120 years old, that history, that biblical history, is often omitted. And I must confess that my book kind of focuses, it does deal with biblical times and ancient history, but because it seeks to move at quite a rapid pace and take in so much history, the greater focus is probably on modernity, the time since Herzl and Leon Pinsker and so forth. But the point that you make is an extremely valid one. And that's why I began the book with the biblical and ancient history, because you can't understand the justness of Zionism, you can't understand the yearning of the Jews to return to their land without understanding what it means to us and why it means so much to us. And that is because of Abraham and God's covenant with him, and the kingdom established by David 1,000 years later.
Absolutely. And also we see that really to understand Zionism, we have to understand history, as you said, and it wasn't until we saw really the destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans in AD 70, and then the expulsion of the Jewish people from your land, being dispersed to the four corners of the earth. Was there a real longing in the hearts of Jewish people to return to Zion, to return to Israel, to return to the ancient covenant homeland where they could govern for themselves? And that has been a yearning in Jewish hearts, particularly this time as we remember the Pesach or Passover, and that longing to return back to Jerusalem. Can you share with us what life was like for the Jewish communities that were dispersed throughout the countries? I mean, there's a different experience that Jewish people faced in, say, the Middle East, living in Islamic countries, to those living in Europe, including the Middle Ages.
Well, firstly, to your earlier point about the dispersal of the Jews and the longing to return, we find that the Jews led a kind of dual existence. On the one hand, they always knew where they came from and where they must strive to return. But on the other hand, they also sought to become good citizens, to integrate and to lead productive, happy lives in the lands where they had found themselves. And the origins of that we can find in Jeremiah. And in his writings to the exiled leaders in Babylon, where he says, pray for the welfare of the city where I've sent you into exile, for in its welfare you will find your own. And so that really is the essence of good citizenry. You may remember where you come from and strive to return there, but note where you are and contribute to the welfare of that place, for in doing so you will find your own welfare. And the reason why the Jews have always strived to be good citizens, law-abiding people wherever they are, I think comes from that history and those ancient commands and prophecies. But the history of the Jews in exile is really a kaleidoscope of pain and suffering and turmoil and anguish and displacement, and also ingenuity and survival. And when we look at things like the Spanish Inquisition, when we look at the onset of pogroms in Russia, the pogrom, which is, for your viewers that may not be familiar with the term, is a kind of spontaneous assault, a violent mob assault on a Jewish community, on a peaceful civilian community, resulting in looting and murder and rape on an incomprehensible scale. And it used to happen with great frequency, particularly in Russia and Poland and that part of the world. But it wasn't confined to that area. So you had similar pogroms in Morocco, places like Fez, in Shiraz, in Iran. You had blood libels in places like Damascus and in Kiev. So you have a remarkable consistency of the way the Jews were treated, whether it was in the Middle East and Islamic lands or in Europe. And that's because wherever the Jews were, they were always a minority group. They were always easily identifiable. They always refused to relinquish their ancient ways and their customs and their obedience to their God. And that led to this sort of oppression. So really, you know, modern Zionism, the impetus for it comes from that history of anti-Semitism, of being treated so poorly, of having our rights withheld, granted, and then trampled again, wherever we were. And it was that desire to finally break that cycle and reclaim what was ours and reclaim our self-determination and our national dignity that led to the creation of the Zionist movement and its ultimate success.
So, Alex, if we look at kind of modern history, we're going back to what, the 19th century, where we really did see the rise of Zionism. But we also saw in France, for example, after the French Revolution in 1789, that the Napoleon granted the Jewish people emancipation and citizenship. We also had the Enlightenment period as well, where Jewish people were more assimilated, I think, into some Western cultures. But what was it about France in particular that was at the time of the 19th century the most sophisticated, one of the most educated societies in the entire world, would actually turn on Dreyfus, Captain Dreyfus, and the whole Dreyfus affair, that really led to the birth of political Zionism, with Theodor Herzl writing his famous book, the Judenstaat, the Jewish state.
Yeah. So, Simon, you beautifully encapsulated the kind of the multiple streams of thought that emerged in the Jewish world through exile. And one was that we needed a national movement, that the Jews would never be truly safe and equal living as minorities in other countries, that they needed their own state and their own homeland. And the other favored assimilation. And they frequently pointed to the French example of the granting of citizenry and equal rights, equal civil rights, to show that through painstaking contribution and efforts and time, and by contributing to wider progressive movements in society, the Jews that way would find their emancipation, their liberty, and their equality, and so forth. But as you allude to rightly, that really is shattered by what happened to Alfred Dreyfus, with the Dreyfus affair, in a magical way, really, like a truly extraordinary way. But equally in parallel with that, what happened to Leon Pinsker in Odessa. So Pinsker came a few years before Herzl. And Pinsker himself was an ardent assimilationist, and he believed that by contributing to the sciences and the literary scene in Russia, that's how emancipation and equality would come, and peace and security would come for the Jews there. But what shattered his belief, his delusion really, were shattering pogroms on a scale that hadn't been seen for a long time. And the fact that they were incited by the intelligentsia, the very class of people that Pinsker thought the Jews needed to go to and to aspire to reach their peace and their security. And that turned him from an assimilationist to a nationalist. And he wrote what was really a crucial foundational text of Zionism called Auto-Emancipation. And he talks about the Jews being like apparitions, having this ghost-like quality, this peculiarity about them, where they're relics of an ancient people, and they bring about this fear of hostility and fear wherever they are. And that only by achieving their equality and self-determination could they end that sort of a condition. Now, Herzl has a similar sort of awakening. Now, Herzl was a deep assimilationist to the extent that he, for a while, believed the Jews should convert en masse to Christianity. You know, he was a writer, he was a playwright, a journalist, and he went to cover the Dreyfus affair, the Dreyfus trial. So Dreyfus was a Jew, a captain in the French army, who was the very model of assimilation, of civil participation, of being a good, loyal citizen. And then he was accused wrongly of passing military secrets to the Germans. And he was subjected to an investigation in which the chief investigator told the French foreign minister that Dreyfus has been suspect for a long time because of his Jewish race. And then this trial was held where outside the courtroom, a mob of Frenchmen cried, "Death to Dreyfus and death to the Jews." And Herzl, who came to report on the trial, saw that his belief in participation and assimilation as the path to peace was a complete illusion. And if someone like Dreyfus could be subjected to this, arrested, tried, convicted, and then imprisoned on some distant island prison, this could happen to any Jew in Europe. And within 6 months, he wrote the first draft of the Judenstaat, the Jewish state. And within a few years, he then convened the first Zionist Congress in Basel, Switzerland. An event that was so momentous that Herzl later reflected, at Basel, I founded the Jewish state, he would later say. So these were seminal events, really key flashpoints in modern times that led to the great writing and the great ideas that created the modern Zionist movement.
Because also at the time, there's also an organic movement that started to develop with Russian Jews, as you say, escaped the horrific pogroms in Russia and in Eastern Europe, and found themselves in Israel, which was controlled by the Ottoman Empire, which was essentially a desert land, completely stripped of trees, with the Ottoman Empire actually building the railway. So they needed trees and woods for their railway expansion, which left what is Israel today absolutely desolate, and with no hope of returning, decided to make a new home for themselves in Israel. They weren't inspired by the Bible. They weren't religious Zionists, but they felt their ancient connection to the homeland of Israel. And of course, that was the first Aliyah in 1882. So don't we see two parallel links? One, the rise of Theodor Herzl and his book, Der Judenstaat, and this political ideology of Zionism emerging. But then we also see this organic movement in Israel at the time, where Russian Jews are starting to make a life for themselves in Israel. And how do the two coincide with each other that really does lead to the re-establishment of the State of Israel on the 14th of May, 1948?
Well, you're quite right. You had the organized Zionist movement, which came from Herzl and the founding of the Zionist Congress, and the creation of groups like the Jewish National Fund to acquire land for settlement and development and so forth. And then you had the organic settlement of the land, which was always the case. So when Jews were forcibly removed from what became Palestine in the year 135 CE under the Roman Emperor Hadrian, who vindictively renamed Judea Syria Palestina to try and sever that Jewish connection to the land, he prohibited entry of Jews into Jerusalem on pain of death. But after Hadrian's own death, that prohibition slowly lapsed and Jews began to return to Jerusalem. There were settlements in places like Tzfat and Tiberias, and elsewhere in the Galilee. So Jews always, to the extent they were able to, maintained a physical, constant connection to the land. And as you say, in the 19th century, during the harshness of state anti-Semitism and the pogroms, and not only from Russia, but also from Romania and Yemen even, Jews simply moved there to build a new life away from persecution and oppression. And there was that kind of dual influence impact on the land through organized Zionism and more organic Zionism. And the two went hand in hand, because the official stream of Zionism dedicated universities, established light industry, manufacturing, to enable more and more people to come, both Jews and Arabs. Whereas the original pioneers set up kind of the roots of agriculture, began to reclaim the land. So they worked hand in hand, and together they helped to really develop the land and make it fertile for mass settlement by Jews over the coming century.
And I mean, we talk about Theodor Herzl, but we also have to acknowledge the incredible role played by Chaim Weizmann, the famous Jewish chemist, for moving to England, in which Britain was the world's superpower of the day with the British Empire. He chose a good university because he went to the same university as I did, the University of Manchester. And there, not only did he obviously was inspired by Theodor Herzl, but really wanted to align Zionism with a major power such as Britain, which, when you look at the origins of Zionism really coming out of Austria and France and Germany, you would have thought maybe this would be more suited to a power like Germany rather than Britain. But Chaim Weizmann chose Britain as a home. And of course, his friendship with Arthur Balfour led to the signing of the Balfour Declaration, which really was the birth certificate for the modern state of Israel. Can you explain the incredible role that Chaim Weizmann played in helping to develop Zionism as a political ideology to then have a backing of the world leading superpower of the day, which was Britain?
So when you look at the story around Weizmann, and you've given a very good summary of it there, as much as we talk about Zionism as a political secular movement, and Herzl was very secular in his outlook, it's difficult not to see the hand of God in the story of Zionism when you look at what happened to Weizmann, how he was able to impact the course of history and the Zionist movement and the return of the Jews to their land. So, before the focus of the Zionist movement became Britain, for the reasons that you described, it was very much Eastern and Central and Western Europe. So Herzl believed that because the Sultan, the Ottomans, held Palestine, that representations should be made there, and they were, with little success. Also, he believed that by approaching the Kaiser and asking him to intercede on behalf of the Jews, to perhaps arrange a purchase of the land or some sort of a colony, a Jewish colony in Palestine under Ottoman rule, perhaps that could be facilitated. He even spoke to the Russian foreign minister. And each time he not only found dead ends, but he found people who in some way were sympathetic to his cause, but they were motivated by their own anti-Semitism. They liked the idea of all the Jews of Russia and Germany leaving their lands, resettling in some backwater, which was then Palestine, and creating Jewish free states in their homelands. That's why they were motivated to help Herzl, not because of any righteous belief or any Christian belief in Zionism and a return of the Jews to their land. And Herzl soon came to realize that if he wanted to succeed with the aims of Zionism, he would have to reorientate the political pressures that he was applying away from Western Europe and the Ottomans and towards London, towards Britain. That's where he realized the fate of Palestine would be determined. And this was incredibly prescient, and he was correct in this. And so he shifts the Zionist congresses, which were happening annually in Basel, eventually to London. And in London, you've got, in the East End, you have the Jewish poor who viewed Herzl as being a Moses-like figure. You had electrifying figures like Israel Zangwill, who through their writing and poetry and oratory were able to really unify the people as well in this cause. But you had a lot of people who were also a lot of Jews in senior positions who were very hostile towards Zionism. People like Edwin Montagu, who had themselves reached privileged positions in society and felt that a separatist movement or a national movement would undo those successes. But then along comes Weizmann, and Weizmann missed the first Zionist Congress. He was in Moscow at the time with his chemistry research, but he attended the second Zionist Congress also in Basel. He was a committed Zionist to his core. And when he was at the University of Manchester lecturing in organic chemistry, he was conducting experiments for some commercial application of synthetic rubber. And he stumbles upon a way of producing acetone en masse. And as it turns out, acetone, when mixed with gunpowder, reduces the smoke given off by heavy guns. And in Britain's naval battles with the Germans in World War I, this would give them a decisive advantage. And so Churchill, who knew Weizmann through his days in Manchester, they spoke at several events together, they had a rapport. Churchill was First Lord of the Admiralty, and he approached Weizmann and said, can you mass produce acetone by a certain period of time? And Weizmann did under great pressure, and this really turned the course of the war in the favor of the Allies, the British and their allies. And this put Weizmann in the company of David Lloyd George, who was then Minister for Munitions and would of course become Prime Minister. And of course, Balfour, who was Foreign Secretary and also Prime Minister at a time. He met people like C.P. Scott, who was then the editor of The Guardian, a very different newspaper to what it is today. And so Weizmann, through his work, which had no connection to anything that you would think would be political, fell into the milieu of these people who could determine the fate of the Jewish people and the fate of Palestine. And he rendered such a service to the state that Lloyd George said to him, is there anything that I can do for you to repay you? And Weizmann replied, there's nothing you can do for me, but there's something you can do for my people. And that came in the form of the Balfour Declaration. Now, it's important to note that foreign policy is not made in such a way. It's not made as favors to people who have rendered a service to the state. It fell within the worldview of many of the leading figures in British politics. They had a romantic, philosophical connection to the idea of a Jewish return to Palestine. It made good sense from a foreign policy perspective as well to set up an ally in a strategic region and so forth. But certainly what Weizmann did played a key part in the handing down of the Balfour Declaration and in changing the course of Jewish and world history.
And of course, he went on to become Israel's first president,
Indeed.
despite the rivalry he had with David Ben-Gurion, who then went on to become Israel's first prime minister. What impact has the Shoah had on kind of Zionism and really showed the world the desperate need of the Jewish people to have their own homeland, particularly in the ancient homeland, which is the modern state of Israel?
Well, look, in my book, I devoted a chapter to the Holocaust and the extent to which the Holocaust contributed to the success of Zionism is a highly politicized, highly debated area. So the critics of Zionism will deceptively, malignantly claim that basically Israel was created purely because of the Holocaust, and it's a burden dropped on the heads of the Arabs to atone for European war guilt. So goes the narrative. And the reason why that's advanced is because it presents this view of the Jews as having no connection to the land and the Arabs and the Palestinians paying for the transgressions of other people. But the truth is, as we've discussed now at length, the Jews had an ancient connection to that land far preceding Islam or the Arab influence in the Levant, firstly. And secondly, the course of Zionism was well on track decades before the Holocaust. So you have the Balfour Declaration in 1917, you have the San Remo Conference, you have the League of Nations mandate for Palestine, the Covenant of the League of Nations. You have the treaties of Lucerne and Sèvres. You have this unbroken chain of international law, of treaties and agreements, which all recognize the right of the Jewish people to a national home in Palestine, in their ancestral lands. So the Holocaust really merely proved the central thesis of Zionism. It proved it without any question whatsoever, proved it definitively, that the Jews could not be safe, could not rely on other peoples to guarantee their safety and their survival. They needed their own state to be able to control their own destiny. And anyone who previously was still skeptical about that or favored the path of assimilation was proved to be utterly wrong by the carnage unleashed on the European Jews in Europe and the failure of the continent at large to protect the Jews from what was happening to them. So the Holocaust really proved the necessity of Zionism. But to say that it in any way led to the creation of the state is a fallacy. And you look at the fact that in 1939, just before Hitler's conquest of Poland in September 1939 and the formal beginning of World War II, you have the white paper handed down by the British, which prohibits Jewish migration to Palestine, limits it to 75,000 Jews, which effectively locks the Jews in a Europe that was about to exterminate them. So really, had it not been for some very dubious policy-making decisions on the part of the British at that time, those Jews could have been saved, and the Jewish state, had it been created decades before as it ought to have been, the Holocaust could potentially have been averted.
Absolutely. I completely concur with you on that one, Alex. Now, when we see really that we see that Israel was re-established on the 14th of May, 1948, and the reason I say it's re-established is because Israel has the Jewish people have their legitimacy from the Bible and throughout history have remained the only people that have never been defeated. And what I mean by that is that the Jewish people have outlived the Egyptians, outlived the Babylonians, outlived the ancient Greeks, the Romans, the Medes, the Persians. I can go on and on. The Nazis, the Soviet Union, and Israel and the Jewish people are here today. So, how much do you think also that we can talk in secular terms, in terms of Zionism as being the political ideology that helped re-established the modern state of Israel. We can look at the movements on the ground of the first wave of Aliyah in 1882, then the second wave of Aliyah in 1904, with the establishment of the kibbutz movement. And then when the British defeated the Ottomans, they became the sole owners or controlled the land, and then they were given that authority by the League of Nations to create the mandate, the British mandate, to prepare the Jewish people for self-determination. But how much is this also linked to the kind of fulfillment of biblical prophecy? The likes, you only have to read Ezekiel 37, which talks about the dry bones, is a perfect picture of a nation that was once dead. The bones were dry, and yet this nation came alive again and became one of the most powerful armies in the world.
Well, I think, one of the great strengths, one of the advantages that we have in advocating for Israel is that we can do it in any myriad of ways. And we can make the case from a textual, religious, biblical perspective. And if you're a person of faith, of any of the monotheistic faiths, you can't deny that this is the promised land for the Jewish people. It kind of begins and ends with that. But if you're a secular person or you wish to advance secular arguments, you can make a slam dunk case in any number of ways. The unbroken physical connection of the Jews to their land. It's something which in the common law system is referred to as native title. The rights of native peoples, indigenous peoples to self-determination is enshrined in the UN covenant. And we keep seeing new archaeological discoveries which attest to a Jewish kingdom, to a Jewish commonwealth, to Jewish peoplehood in the land thousands of years ago. And then if you move to modern times, I spoke about this before, about the unbroken chain of international law, which definitively established the right of the Jewish people to self-determination in their ancestral lands, beginning with the Balfour Declaration and going on and on and on, and culminating in the League of Nations, in the UN Partition Plan in 1947, November 29th, 1947, and of course, the establishment of the state, 14th of May the following year. So in the beginning of my book, in the introduction, Alan Dershowitz says that, and he looks at it from a strictly legal point of view, that Israel has the best, clearest birth certificate of any modern democracy because of all of these factors, irrefutable factors, before you even get into the biblical side of things. So, as people of faith, you and I, Simon, can see the hand of God here. It's unmissable. But equally, when we go out to the world and advocate to different peoples of different political persuasions and outlooks, you can make the case in any number of ways.
Excellent. And I mean, how exciting must it have been for the Jewish people to actually recognize that the modern state of Israel was born on one day by the Declaration of Independence, read out loud by Israel's then pioneering Prime Minister, David Ben-Gurion, on the 14th of May, 1948, only for a few hours later to realize that Israel would have to fight for independence when she was invaded by 5 Arab armies.
Yeah, and I talk about that moment on the 14th of May, 1948, when the Jews had their homeland again for the first time in nearly 2 millennia. And when you consider everything that passed in those intervening years, the horror, the misery, the things on a scale that is truly incomprehensible, to then have their homeland again. And I quote Amos Oz when he talks about being a boy at that time and seeing his father cry. The only time I ever saw him cry was at that moment of independence. And it's a remarkable thing. It would have been a remarkable thing to live through as a Jew. But when you study Jewish history, you see that nothing comes easily. And whenever you think that something is going to happen, that the worst has passed and a new dawn is upon us, something grim and terrible happens again. And you're right. Israel realized they had a brief moment of euphoria in the foundation of the state on that day. But then they realized they would have to defend it. And they were prepared for it, of course. You had the Haganah, you had the Irgun, they were ready to fight, and they were importing arms, and they did fight. And it began with a civil war, of course, and then it led to a full-blown invasion on every frontier. But Israel held on, and it held on because, again, it was blessed by the Almighty. It held on because it had no choice but to win. There was no alternative. There was nowhere else to go. And you had this nation of Holocaust survivors and kibbutzniks that somehow cobbled together this civilian army and won, defeated far greater forces. And there's something so awe-inspiring in that story. And it's one of the reasons why for a long time, I digress slightly here, but why Israel had the attention and the captivation of left-wing movements around the world, because they looked at Israel as being this plucky little power, standing up to far greater powers in the region and somehow winning and standing its ground and toppling structures of power. So it kind of shows how alliances come and go as well, and friends come and go, but the Jewish people sustain and we endure.
Absolutely. So we've got about 10 minutes left of the program, Alex. So I need to pack in a few very important questions for you as you go on. I suppose the most defining moment in modern Jewish history has to be with the Six-Day War in June 1967, when the Israeli army, the IDF, liberated Jerusalem and the biblical heartland of Israel, Judea and Samaria. Now, this must have been euphoric, particularly for Soviet Jewry as well, who were watching these events and feeling confident for the first time that there is a Jewish nation that has defeated these powerful Arab armies in Egypt and Jordan and Syria, and that Israel is essentially at that time the envy of the world, because what Israel did in military terms was nothing but extraordinary.
Yeah, and that feeling of euphoria also came with initially a feeling of incredible peril. And the sense among Jewish communities around the world was that they were on the cusp of a second Holocaust, that there would be an annihilation, and it was being promised outwardly, unvarnished. You had calls from Hafez al-Assad, who's the father of the current butcher of Syria, Bashar al-Assad, talking about paving the roads with the skulls of the Jews and driving them into the sea, and all these bone-chilling threats. And they, of course, acted on them with their invasion, or their purported invasion. So the fact that the victory came in such extraordinary and decisive and swift terms, having been in that period of great peril, made it all the more overwhelming and extraordinary. And that really transformed the region, because suddenly Israel establishes itself not merely as someone hanging on to its land, but capable of actually inflicting pain on those who dare to attack it. It, of course, created a new kind of status quo where Israel could bargain the land that it captured for peace with the Arab states that were willing to give up its enmity and hostility with Israel. And that was obviously the notion of land for peace, as enshrined in UN Security Council Resolution 242, was the formula that led to peace with Egypt and also with Jordan. And arguably that's those peace treaties are what led us today to the Abraham Accords, showing what is to be gained from peace with Israel, that Israel is a good neighbor, dependable ally, and the peace is to be pursued with it. So certainly transformed the region and created obviously the Palestinian issue, which prior to that point was always viewed as a refugee issue. There was never a notion of forming a Palestinian state in the West Bank. But so it transformed the region in many ways and realigned relations between Israel and the Arab world and the world at large.
And we also have to discuss the shocking UN resolution, I think, of 1977, which was led by the PLO leader, then chairman Yasser Arafat, who is nothing but a terrorist, and that's his legacy. But in that UN Security Council resolution, they define Zionism as racism. And this is where the battle for Israel's very legitimacy started, isn't it?
Indeed, indeed. And the final chapter of my book is called Anti-Zionism, and I look at the counter movement that formed to oppose and to defeat Zionism and to undo its successes. And that really, it was in 1975 in the General Assembly, was really a key moment. But no, you're quite right. It was a defining moment in the modern political war, the war of delegitimization against Israel, because this ludicrous notion about Zionism being racism, and I talk about some of the backroom dealings which led to the passage of that resolution, which involved the Soviet Union, and the process by which it actually passed the General Assembly. It was first floated at a women's conference in Mexico, which few people would have noticed. It was just quietly stuck into the manifesto there. Then it appeared in a conference of African nations, and it shows how the political war against Israel works in practice. It's based on incremental gains, seemingly trivial things that occur in local party branches and local government and university campuses, but they build up, they create a momentum, and they eventually create a mass movement and a whole psychology of confronting Israel and the Jewish people. And if you want to understand how the political war is waged, really the Zionism is Racism resolution is kind of the archetype for that. And it also shows how it's to be defeated by not withdrawing from hostile contested forms, by standing up and fighting those forces, because each of those seemingly small and trivial gains then leads to horrid outcomes down the track. And with that one in particular, you saw, once the General Assembly decreed Zionism to be racism, 4 universities in the UK expelled their Jewish societies on the basis they're Zionist and therefore racist, and therefore shouldn't be on campus. So you see how it goes from there to other institutions and across civil society, and then has a great influence on the way the public views Israel and the Jewish people.
How important is it in the, we've got less than 5 minutes now, how important is it that the Jewish people, that the Israelis themselves, as well as Christian Zionists around the world, rally behind Zionism? Because Israel's achievements as a state have been absolutely extraordinary, to the extent that the Sunni Arab world now recognize that without Israel being in that region, that they are the only stable and peaceful power in the actual region. And in order to defeat, for example, the Islamic Republic of Iran, and also to push back on the Muslim Brotherhood, being controlled and influenced by Turkey and Qatar, that Israel is now the most powerful force in the region.
Well, to me, it's utterly essential that we understand Zionism and unify behind it and defend it. And something that is put to me quite regularly is that, with the creation of the State of Israel, is that not the completion of the Zionist project? And therefore, we're in a post-Zionist era. But the way that I understand Zionism is not merely about the goal of creating a Jewish state, which, yes, has been achieved, but it's about the rights underpinning that notion, the rights that go into Zionism. And those are the rights of equality, the rights of self-determination, the rights to be treated like every other people on earth, rights which have been historically withdrawn or trampled in the case of the Jews. So we may have our Jewish state today, but nothing can be taken for granted. And when we stand up and defend Zionism, we're not really defending the State of Israel, which in many ways is capable of defending itself. We're defending the rights, the inalienable rights of the Jewish people to equality. And that is why I would urge all thinking people, all people of goodwill, to support Zionism because of exactly what it represents.
Absolutely, because we've seen that Zionism, particularly since the Second Intifada started in 2000 with the violent Palestinian uprising using suicide bombings and terrorism that brought misery to Israelis, was really being defamed. It's been attacked. It's been described as being racist. And yet this is the spiritual and political ideology that not only underpins the modern state of Israel, but also provides a sense of hope and inspiration for the Jewish communities around the world. How important is it that the Jewish people are confident about who they are and their identity, and the fact that they are connected to the land of Israel?
Well, one of the things that truly motivated me to write this book was to speak to young Jews, to show them that they belong to a truly extraordinary people, a people that have withstood things which are incomprehensible, a people of fortitude that have given the world ethical monotheism, and a people with a just and unimpeachable right to a state in their ancestral lands. And it's fine to defend against anti-Zionists and anti-Semites and stand up to that, but it should always be from a position of strength and confidence. We've earned that right. I have incredible faith in our story, in the veracity of that story, in the justness of our cause, and it's from that perspective we should advocate.
Absolutely. And Alex, can you share with us a very practical question now, how our viewers can get hold of your incredible book, Zionism, the Concise History?
Thank you, Simon. Well, they can order either through my personal website, which is alexryvchin.com, or they can buy it on Amazon, Book Depository, Waterstones, I think, anywhere in the world, online or in bookstores it should be, or contact me directly for a signed copy.
Excellent. That sounds very good. Alex, thank you so much for being my special guest all the way from Australia on this home edition of the Middle East Report. And I want to thank you for watching this program. Zionism is the spiritual and political ideology that became the vehicle that helped the Jewish people return to their ancient covenant homeland and re-establish the modern state of Israel, which is now an economic, military superpower in the Middle East. And certainly as we emerge out of this COVID-19 crisis, Israel is going to be one of the strongest nations in the world, because Israel is, after all, the people of the book, that is the Jewish people. So it's so imperative that we understand what Zionism is. So therefore, it's highly recommended that you get hold of Alex's book called Zionism, the concise history, and really understand the history of Israel, to understand the history of the Jewish people and why Zionism matters so much today. So thank you for watching today's Middle East Report.